For those of you who don't know Shireen, she is the daughter of Baba's youngest brother, Adi Jr., and her mother, Franny. And today you're going to hear these amazing stories of her father and her mother, and of course, right before what happened when Shireen was born. And I have to just add this little piece, and I'll turn it over to you. I'm rephrasing a little bit. When Shireen was born, Baba told her parents, "She is more dear to me than she is even to you." So, dear Shireen, thank you for coming all this way. And yes, a round of applause. Jai Baba.
Well, thank you so much, Jai Baba. First of all, Robert, I mean, that's a tough act to follow, so you have to be very indulgent. That was incredible, incredible music. Thank you so much for inviting us. We love coming to LA. When we moved from London to America in 1991, and I think it was in 1992 that my mum and I were invited, you graciously invited us to be your guest speakers at Pilgrim Pines. So we have a long connection to this LA group. And for those of you who were here, I think it was 2 years ago, all of you put on the most beautiful memorial for my mum because she felt so connected to this group. So that was the last time we were here, and we're really glad to be back again. Thank you so much. I know you've had some incredible guest speakers, and I'm honored to be in their company. You've had amazing people speak. So what I was going to do today, I'm telling 3 lots of stories. So today, I thought I would just talk a bit about my parents. So I talk a bit about my parents. I mean, their stories are extraordinary, but a little bit about their histories, how they met, and how my family, our family, ended up in England. Because we were the only ones. My father was the only one of Baba's siblings to leave India and to live in the West. I was the only one of my generation to be born in the West. So, we were a little different. And that came about in, of course, the way that Baba planned it all. So, to give some context, as Payam said, and thank you for that nice introduction. Oh, and I want to, I've already said thank you to the LA Sahavas Committee for inviting us, to our wonderful hosts, the Ajang family, who have welcomed us so beautifully. Thank you very much. So my father was Adi Jr., Baba's youngest brother, and he was considerably younger than Baba. Anyone here met him? Yeah? Yeah, okay. Who are you?
Steve Berry.
Oh, all right.
I met your Baba in 1971.
In London?
Yes.
Wow, okay, yeah. So, my dad was Adi Jr. Junior was the distinction from Adi K, who was Adi Senior. So, of course, my father was born into Baba's family and grew up knowing and loving Baba for who he was. My mum, to give some context, she was the niece of Sarosh Irani, who some of you may have known. Sarosh was married to Vilu. She was Sarosh's niece, and she adored Sarosh. She always said she loved him more than she loved her own father. And she was Goher and Katie Irani's first cousin, and Meru's second cousin. And, if any of you have been to India or have read anything, I mean, the Iranis, it's just, find an Irani, we're related to them. So, in fact, where are you? We think we're related to, I've forgotten where you are. But anyway, there's a young woman here who probably am related to. So my paternal grandfather, Din Shah, who was Sarosh's brother, was a very devout Zoroastrian, and you all know that Baba was born into a Zoroastrian family. So Din Shah, my grandfather, paternal grandfather, was a great believer in the Zoroastrian faith. My grandmother Suna Mai, as we called her, also was a very devout Zoroastrian, but she loved Baba. She met Upasni Maharaj. She took my mum to see Upasni Maharaj. So that's something that my mother, would talk about. So in those days, my maternal grandparents ended up living in quite a nice house. Opposite, if you know Vilu Villa, there's a field, and it was opposite or across that field. Prior to that, the Iranis lived in what they used to call a joint family system. So everyone lived together in what are now the trust quarters, but then were Kushru quarters. So my mum lived there, and everything that happened, it was communal. So I don't know what year, but I think my mum was about 6 or 7 when she started to notice Baba, because Baba would visit Kushru quarters. My husband Jay is there, and he's going to correct me if I'm wrong. A. B, if I am wrong, look it up all you want. Don't email me. I'm not great with, dates and chronology. So my mum used to talk about this incredible memory. So she saw Baba for the first time. And she was, I don't know, maybe on the veranda. Baba was over there, and he was walking. And she looked at him, and he was all in white. And she's spoken about this, but she said it wasn't as though he were walking, rather he was floating. And she wondered, who is this man? Who is this magician? What's going on? So with Baba, often my father, who would become my father, was with Baba, a very young man. And because there was about a 9-year age difference between my parents, my mother actually used to call my father Adi Uncle. She ended up marrying him, but that was the respectful way in India, your elder. So, but first of all, she noticed Baba. So her mother took her to have an audience with Baba, to see Baba. And this happened a few times. And my mum has told those stories, and they're quite wonderful. My grandmother, Sunamai, was absolutely devoted to Baba. And to his great credit, my paternal grandfather, Dinshaw, never, ever minded. He respected Baba. He didn't try and stop his wife, from going to Baba. I mean, I think that's quite remarkable, really, for that era. And he didn't mind his young daughter being taken to meet Baba. So my mum had this one particular time with Baba that she used to talk about, where she was excited, she was going to meet Baba. And she thought she'd better do something to herself. So she had long hair, and she put it in these very tight, curls, like rollers, ringlets. And when she took everything out, her hair just completely went into a gigantic kind of puffed, event up in her head. And so she went to Baba, and Baba apparently, Elizabeth was there, and Baba said to Elizabeth, who is this girl with the powder puff on her head? And another story she would tell was that my poor mum went to a boarding school at the age of, I think, 6, if you can imagine such a thing. To her parents' credit, they felt that their daughter should have the same educational opportunities as her brothers. My mum was one of 4. She had 3 younger brothers. She was the eldest. And in those days, the schools in Ahmednagar weren't good. So my grandparents sent the boys to boarding school in Mumbai, Bombay. And they thought my mum should go too. So at this very tender age, my mum was sent off to boarding school. But it's not as harsh as it sounds. There was so many extended family. She always went on the weekends to visit this Masi, that, all of them. All of them were there. So that's, she told me stories about that, and it was heart-wrenching, actually. So she'd come home from school So one time, my grandmother Suna took my mum to meet Baba, and Baba asked Suna questions and how's Franny and how's her education, and Suna said, Baba, Franny's growing too tall. I mean, every time she comes home from school, she grows, and I'd have to replace her clothes. Can you do something? So Baba put his hand on her head, and she never grew after that. And the other thing she liked to talk about was that Baba told her that she would go far, that she would travel. And she was very surprised by this because nothing in her life at that time suggested that she might travel. And of course she did. She traveled across the ocean to live in England. So time moved on, and my parents married. They fell in love and they got married. And they married on the 20th of November, 1947, which was the same day and year that the Queen and Prince Philip married. And my mum thought this was, the best thing. So she was very happy about that. So they married, and they lived in various places, actually. They lived all over. They lived in Pune. I think they lived in Nagar. I don't think they lived in Bombay. And they would have my brother Dara. I'm sure many of you have met Dara. Dara would go and stay with them for extended periods, but I wasn't born. So my parents never had a traditional honeymoon. So in 1952, Baba arranged. Everything was arranged by Baba. It's hard to overstate. Everything was arranged by Baba. Baba's permission was asked. He was consulted. I mean, Baba was absolutely the center of everything in their lives, in our life in England. So Baba arranged for them to go on a honeymoon. He said to my dad, Franny never got a honeymoon. We'll go to Europe. And just backtracking a little bit. So my parents obviously grew up in British India. They both went to British schools. My mum went to this quite severe Protestant boarding school where the non-Christians had to pay double. So Christian. The non-Christians had to pay double. But she had some great experiences. She made some good friends. And she loved everything British. She just was fascinated. And she loved the Queen. And she loved Western fashion. She was quite the fashion plate, in those days. Her father ran a shop. And all the Britishers, as they were called, would go to the shop to buy supplies, goods, food, British food, magazines, paper patterns for making clothes. So Mum, you could do it in those days. You go to the family tailor, you just take a photograph, make this for me. So Mum was really dressed well and loved all the Western films. And in fact, she had wonderful stories about, Baba suddenly there'd be a message at 5 a.m. Baba wanted to go to Suraj Cinema. So he'd summon everyone, and he invited my mum often. So she'd get the message, 5 a.m. to go and see a film. And it would be maybe a Marx Brothers film or Laurel and Hardy or whatever was playing then. And she'd get all dolled up in her, in her Western outfits. So she really had a strong connection to England. Her teachers were British. She liked her teachers. She liked English literature. My father also went to a British school, and he particularly liked his English professors. Also, my father was a really young man when he started traveling with Baba and when so many of the Western disciples went to India. So at a really young age, 16, 17, my father met, Elizabeth, Kitty, Jane, I presume these are all people you know, Margaret Cross, Delia Dillian. So a lot of those people went to India. All the ladies fell for him. They really did. And he got into some trouble for that, later on, poor man. He couldn't help it, but anyway. And then Baba took him on his, was it his first trip abroad, he took my dad. And given that this is a Silence Day, Sahavas, I mean, I have a story that I can tell next time. But my father was born on 10th of July, what was to become Silence Day. And because Baba wanted to take him on that first trip to East Chalicum in Devon, if you all know about that, and then I think Portofino at the same time, you know, a lot of the European countries. Well, my father was too young to travel. He was too young to get a passport, because in those days, of course, the British, you know, wouldn't let the Indians have a passport until they were 18. So Baba, you know, that wasn't a problem for Baba. Baba just said, well, we'll give you a new birthday, and no worries about birth certificates, you know. So Baba invented, you know, a new birthday for my father, which was the 18th of September. So he took Baba on the trips, and, you know, I always used to say to my father, you know, only you would have two birthdays. We had to celebrate both birthdays. My father and the Queen had two birthdays. So my dad, you know, was taken on these trips, and he went to England, and he loved England. He was there at East Chalicum. He became really good friends with so many of those early English Baba lovers. Will and Mary Beckett, if you know of them, Dr. Donkin, who was actually my godfather, Herbert Davy, and then, of course, the Western ladies. So both of my parents had this strong connection to England. So just going back a little bit, they married in 1947. They lived, like I say, they lived in a few different places. My mum always joked that every house they ever lived in was either next to a Tower of Silence or a cemetery. She said it was just, that was somehow. There was one just lovely story when they lived, I think, in Pune, outside Pune. And my mum was so funny. She said, oh, we rented this house, and, you know, it was a bit dusty and a bit dirty, and, you know, we had to sweep the cobras away. And I was like, oh, God, you had to sweep the cobras away. So they lived in this rather remote house. And, you know, they were newlyweds. And one day, I suppose they had a servant or two, and someone came. No, my father said, you know, I can see a car. And my mum was, oh. And my dad said, oh, it's Baba's car. Well, they weren't ready. You know, they had no idea Baba was coming. So the car drove up. My mum quickly put it, she wasn't even dressed properly. And Baba came unexpectedly to lunch. And there's a really great photo of Baba and my parents at their front door. So my mum was so nervous, and there wasn't enough food, and she was dropping crockery. She was so nervous. And Baba held her hand and told her it was okay. The lunch was okay. I mean, he was so sweet. So there are many more stories, but they're probably written in some of the books. So for various reasons, my mum really steered this. They wanted to move. They wanted to leave India and move to the West. America came up, and there were some inroads to America, and Don Stevens was possibly going to be a sponsor, but it all fell through. And Baba said, no to America. Forget America. If you go anywhere, it has to be England. Well, that made my mum really happy, because she'd been engineering this, you know, for a while. And just parenthetically, when Jay and I decided to move to the States, you know, in 1991, and we asked Money, my Aunt Money, because everything, every decision really went through Money. She actually was a little ambivalent about our coming to this country, because Baba hadn't wanted my parents to move. But we, you know, told her our reasoning, and she said, okay, you know, she kind of gave her blessing. So my parents did move, and they moved to England in 1956. And like many immigrants, you know, it was hard. It was really hard for them. Now, my mum had that kind of zeal. You know, she was so determined to be in England, and she was going to make it work. So my dad had had odd jobs in India. He trained as a doctor of homeopathy, so I grew up on homeopathy as a complement to allopathic medicine. He never sort of just eschewed allopathic medicine, but I think he had goats at one point. I mean, he had a little carpentry business, but he wasn't equipped to move to another country, really, and support a family. My mum hadn't worked, you know. She grew up in a fairly privileged sort of life. I mean, her uncle Soresh was the mayor of the town. They were a prominent family. And she knew that she was going to have to work. So they arrived in England. They had some help because of the Barber connections. And they stayed initially with Minta, who was Delia Dillion's sister. And she had a beautiful, beautiful mansion. But before that, I think perhaps initially they stayed with Minta. And then, for various reasons, they didn't want to stay there anymore. And then they tried to find other accommodations. And, you know, they did experience some prejudice. Even though they weren't part of that wave of immigrants, they were not. Nonetheless, my mum wore a sari, and they had some doors slammed in their faces, but they were looking in the wrong parts of London, let's say. So I don't know the exact chronology of this, but eventually only Barber, made it possible for them to buy a house. And he named the house MeherBabaLibrary, and that's where I grew up. So Barber basically gave that house to them. But they had some struggles before that. So my mum loved England despite the difficulties, despite the fact that they didn't have an income, really. My father really didn't like it. He hated the cold. He hated the food. He just thought it was awful. And he actually said to my mum, you know, if you're going to make me move to England, then at least cook Indian food for me. Well, my mum had never learned to cook. She ended up being the most phenomenal cook, especially of Indian cuisine. And in those days, you know, there weren't any Indian shops. So there were maybe one spice vendor in the heart of London. But one of her brothers was an airline pilot, and he would bring spices from England to London. But my mum, you know, remember she told me this story that she thought she better make my father rice and dal. You know, she felt bad. She dragged him to England. He didn't like it. At least I'll make his food. So she cooked the rice by just pouring it into the pan and then just sautéing it. She didn't know that you had to put it in water. She did the same thing with dal. She just plonked it into the pan. It was all dancing around. But eventually she did become this incredible, incredible cook. So they moved in 1956, and in 1956, Barber came to England and stayed at the Rubens Hotel, which is a hotel in town, in London. And I actually ended up working just around the corner from that hotel. So he called, you know, my parents to see him, Delia, or Fred Marks, you all know Fred Marks, all those people. I mean, my parents knew everyone there, you know, all of those people. And he called my parents, you know, for a meeting, and my mum had a private meeting with Barber. And she looked a little downcast. And Barber said, you know, are you all right? And she said, oh, you know, Barber, it's a little difficult. And he, well, why is it difficult? She said, well, I can't find work. And Adi has work, but my dad he'd rented a little shop, and he started an antiques business, which is what he actually ended up doing as his career. That was what he started. But it wasn't going very well. The shop wasn't going well. So she said, you know, Adi's work isn't going well, and I can't find a job. She had applied to quite a few jobs. Sorry, I have to say, she had the brainwave of taking a course in as a beautician. She looked into, well, what could she do? You know, what could she do that wouldn't take long to learn? So she did her went to beauty school at this company called Delia Collins. So she got her certificates and tried to find work at various places, and nothing was happening. So she told Baba this. She said, it's a little difficult. And Baba said to her, you know, you must find a job. And he said, he gave her a deadline. He said, if you haven't found a job by that time, then you must come back to India. And she was really sad to hear this, because she thought, it's not going to happen. My father, meanwhile, was over the moon, you know, when he heard this. And then he asked her, he said, do you want a baby? And she said, well, if it's your will, Baba, I'd like a baby. And my parents had been married for 10 years at that point, so I assume they had wanted to have a baby. Of course, I had my brother, Dara. So he said to her, you know, don't worry, Franny, you'll have a baby and she will be a girl. So my mum was so happy to hear that. So she came out and told my father what Baba had said. And my father was, you know, slightly rubbing his hands like, thank God, because probably Franny won't get the job and we can go back to India. I mean, he wanted her to be happy, but it didn't look like this in England adventure was working, you know. So my mom was quite despondent and she talked to Delia, maybe she talked to Minta. Did any of you meet Minta or Delia? Yeah. Minta was very stylish. And she said to my mum, she said, you know, Franny, my mum was wearing saris. She had beautiful long hair, which she'd put up. And Minta said, Franny, just try wearing a dress and cut your hair. Try to look more Western. So my mother, you know, she was willing to try anything. And she did that. So then she got an interview. And I think it might have been at Elizabeth Arden, that company. I'm not sure. I could be wrong. Don't fact check me. But she went for this interview, and she was feeling down in the dumps. You know, she was just feeling like, well, this is not going to work out. She was the last person to be called in. She saw all these women, you know, called in before her. They all came out. So she went in and thought, well, I'll just go. I'll just do it. You know, give it one last shot. So the man was really nice. And they spoke, and then at the end he said to her, when can you start? So she said, immediately, you know. And she was over the moon. So meanwhile, my poor father's sitting out there. He went with her, thinking, this is it, finally we get to go home. And she said, guess what, I've got the job. So she started the job, and then she became pregnant with me. So she went back to wearing saris. She hid the pregnancy by wearing saris, and then told them, and worked until she felt, you know, she couldn't work anymore. So she got 2 wishes, which, you know, is wonderful, really. So, you know, my dad accepted it, and life began in London. You know, again, my father was the only one of Baba's siblings to have left India. And I know this from my own experience, once I came along, and from what they told me. But regardless, their lives were completely intertwined with Baba's. Baba was present, ever present. In those days, telegrams were the mode of communication. Telegrams back and forth. Any little decision, actually even a little decision, went through Baba. Baba had his eye on them. You know, it's one of those remarkable things where you just wonder how on earth could he, well, he's God, you know, be so attentive to us over there when he also had his family in India. You know, I'm one of several nephews and nieces. You probably know my cousins, the twins, Rustam and Sorab, my brother Dara. I mean, but Baba had the time, you know, as I suppose only God in human form can, to shower our family with attention. And so I don't believe my parents ever felt cut off, even though they were living so far away. So I was born in 1957, And, telegrams came from Baba and Mera, and my mum was so happy about that. And as was the custom anyway, but of course my mum wanted me as a baby to meet Baba, they decided to ask Baba's permission. He said yes. So my parents took me to India when I was 3 months old. And I met Baba, of course, that was their goal, but also to meet my grandparents and to go back and see Dara, who was living with Vilu and Sarosh at that point, I think. I think that's right. So my dad stayed for about 2 months, and I think my mum and I stayed for about 6 months. So my dad had to come back for work. So my mum, of course, was very keen for me to meet Baba, and also simultaneously very worried that I'd scream or, Baba had a moustache then. I was very frightened of men with moustaches, so she was hoping that I wouldn't look at him and start screaming. And she was worried that I also wouldn't, make a mess on him. I was a baby. And so I'm not sure how many times I was taken to meet Baba. And of course, then I met the ladies, my aunties. So I was placed on Baba's lap. And I'm just telling this as I've heard it. Obviously, I don't remember anything. This is just what I've heard from my mum, from Mani, Erich. So I was very well behaved. I gurgled, I giggled, I did all the nice things that babies do. I didn't make a mess on Baba. I wasn't frightened of his moustache. And I suppose I was facing out, and I swiveled my head right around and looked at him. And apparently, again, this is what I was told, we looked at each other for a long time. And Baba then said, and I'm slightly paraphrasing, Baba said, "You all think we haven't met before." And I don't know if he specifically mentioned this person, but someone very close to Baba, a young girl had died. And I think her name might have come up. So, very understandably, that family, I was told, thought that I might be that girl. And it was very moving, apparently, because Baba he didn't make a big thing about it, but he just indicated. And we always saw that family. Whenever we went to India, Baba said, "Go and see them." And when Baba dropped his body, Mera said, "Go and see them." And they never said anything to me. There was nothing. It was just very sweet. So, of course, my mum was so happy that all went well. So I must have, as a baby, I was there. So then my mum brought me and my brother Dara back to England. So I grew up my whole life with Dara. Now, a lot of you have met Dara, obviously. So there's a 13-year age difference between us. So he was very much my big brother. So he came to England, and we all started our lives in Mehmansell, London, home to, some very interesting visits and adventures. My parents were, they weren't poor because we had food, but they struggled. Really, my whole childhood was, I didn't think about it in that way, but I think we were basically broke most of the time. But we always managed, and Baba was a great help in that way. And but they had to really try to make ends meet. So one of the things that they did that was a very smart decision, the house that we lived in, it was a big house. It was a big Victorian house with quite a number of stories. So they rented out rooms, so we had lodgers. And we had some really interesting people, through the years. One particular person stayed with us, and she became a Baba follower. And she was an Italian lady called Mama Polly. And she helped my mum a lot with me when I was little. And then Fred Marks, do some of you know who he was? Well, he lived in our garden shed for about 6 months, I think. But I don't remember a day in my childhood, honestly, when there wasn't somebody else living in our house. And I'll talk later about the sort of American influx. But whether it was, lodgers or the occasional barber lover who didn't have anywhere to stay, my parents were really generous. They really welcomed people and they opened their home, and they did not have much. But people came, people came to stay. I mean, our lodgers, our official lodgers, paid rent. But, we'd have people who'd come to stay for a few weeks. Several years later, they were still there. Going forward, it's how I met Jay. Going forward, after Baba dropped his body, Bob Brown, he stayed with us. He wrote some of his most beautiful songs in our house, and so on and so forth. But I'll talk about all of that next time. So my growing up, and how am I for time, please? Okay, good. So my growing up was, in a funny way, I had two lives. So England back then, this was the early 60s, mid-60s, was quite socially conservative, much more so than it is now. We lived on a really nice, sort of bucolic, leafy street in London, in a beautiful part of London. It was gorgeous. And our house was named Meher by Baba, as I said. My parents moved in, my father immediately ripped out all the windows and instead, put an arch to make it look sort of Eastern. And Baba's photo was in the window. So people saw this photo. And I always like to fancy, I'm sure it's not the case, but our house was plonk in the middle of this street, and there was a church on one side and the vicarage on the other side. And England then was strongly, Church of England. And I went to not a Christian school, but in those days, school was Church of England. So you had Christian prayers, Christian assembly, Christian hymns. So I went to this very sweet little school and learnt all about Jesus and, sang hymns and all of that. And the next time I went to India, I was 7, and that was when my whole family went, and I'll tell you some of those stories tomorrow. So growing up, our house was just full of Baba's photos. Everywhere. And I would look at these photos. I know I did that, and I know that I was told that this was my uncle. But I don't think I ever questioned, why are there so many photos of this uncle and not photos of that uncle? But I know I learnt Baba's name, and I learnt about my aunts, to whom I became so close. They were so important in my life. And, it really wasn't talked about too much. I knew we were different. I knew that we came from India. I knew that, I wasn't like my English friends, and we had photos of my uncle all over the house. And I don't think, as a child at that age, you don't really question too much. It's just the norm. It's how life is. We really were very, we lived in a wonderful neighborhood, as I said. My parents became friends with every incumbent vicar. All the vicars came to our house. One became a Baba lover and was excommunicated from whatever the word is from the Church of England. That happened later on. That was such an incredible story. But he disappeared. I'm jumping ahead, and our neighbours, would ask, where did Father Roger go? And I'd just be, I don't really know, but we'd lend him some Baba books. Anyway, so it was interesting. My parents became very friendly with, as I say, with the vicars. One of them went off to India. So the time came, and then I will tell the actual stories tomorrow, but the time came for, in the Zoroastrian tradition, for the Naujot ceremony. Does any one of you know what that is? So it's sort of the equivalent of what, confirmation perhaps in the Catholic Church? So at the age of 7, sort of age of 7 to 10, 11, a child born into the Zoroastrian faith has a Naujot ceremony, and that sort of inducts you into the faith. And 7 is the magic number, you're spiritually ready for this. So because my grandfather was quite important, in the town of Ahmednagar, and he was a devout Zoroastrian, he very much wanted his granddaughter, who was living in another country, to still have the Zoroastrian rites of passage. So, as with everything, my parents either telegrammed or wrote to Baba and said, "Is this okay? Can Shireen have the Naujot ceremony?" And Baba very sweetly said, "Yes, you can come." So we went in 1965. I always get a bit confused whether it was 64 or 65. And we were there for 3 months. I took time off school. So again, I'll talk about this tomorrow, but before we went to India, in my memory, that was the first time my father told me who Baba was. So, this was a big, big, big event in our family. I mean, I'd heard about India. I knew my parents were born in India. I knew my brother was born in India. I was born in London. We were going to go to India. I was going to have this big ceremony. My mum was frantically sewing these pretty little dresses for me. And I suppose my father thought it would be good for me to know who I was going to meet. So, I was 7, but my father was very much to the point, and I do remember he sat me down and he pointed to the photos of Baba. And he said, "Do you know who that is?" And I said, "That's my uncle, Uncle Baba." And he said, "Yes, he is your uncle," but he said, "He is also God in human form." So then I piped up and said, "Well, what about Jesus?" Because I'd been going to a school where I was told Jesus had been God in human form. So my dad said, "Well, yes, Jesus was God in human form, and now he's come back again as Baba." And I said, "Oh, and he's my uncle." And he said, "Yes, I'm his brother." So, of course, at the age of 7, that was just totally fine and normal to me. I had no problem with that. And I was very excited to hear this. Astonishing news. And then my dad said, "So we're going to go to India. You're going to have the Naujot ceremony. You're going to have to learn lots and lots of prayers." And he then really said, "And you have to behave in India." Now, I wasn't a badly behaved child. I was quite a well-behaved child. But I often think, for any of you who've taken your children to meet Meher and Mani, maybe you were a little nervous, hoping they'd behave. Well, for my parents, they were taking me to meet Baba. I was born in the West. I'm sure they were a little anxious. Was I going to somehow be, too Western? Or they wanted me to really behave. So I got quite a few lectures from my father before the trip, and my excitement was building up and up. And I will talk about this tomorrow, but once I got the news from my dad, that my uncle was God, again, not having the self-consciousness that one might at the age of 7, I went to school the next day and told my best friend and said, my uncle's God. And that was fine with her. She had totally, So I asked Baba a lot of questions when I was 7, and my friend and I came up with one of the questions that I asked Baba. So maybe I should stop now. Is that about right in terms of timing? Who's
Yes, this is a good time, unless you want to end with a particular story.
Well, I thought tomorrow I'd just start with what it was like to go anyway. And sorry I was a bit all over the map, but... Yes.
Okay, so if you have any questions, we'll just keep it to one or two because of time for today, about her parents, specifically, Audie Jr., Franny. Yeah, this might be time. I have a question, but I'll wait if anybody else has a question.
Why was Dara left in India?
My father married Dara's mother, and Dara... So Dara was born 13 years before I was. And very sadly, Dara's mother died. So, years later, my parents married. Dara was left in India for that initial period with the idea that I'm not, because it's so much Dara's story, but with the idea that Dara would come after my parents had settled and had found a home in London. I think there also might have been the idea that if Dara wanted to stay in India, that would be his choice. He chose to come. And I don't know how on earth they would have worked it out if he had said he didn't want to come. Perhaps that would have been a reason for them to go back to India. But the idea, as I understand it, was that they were always going to come back. My mum was going to come back with Dara and me. And that's how it worked out, yeah.
I'm sorry if you addressed this, but why did they move to England, especially if your dad didn't want to?
Well, my mum really pushed it. She wanted it so much, and he was willing to give it a try. And despite, his reservations, he really did like the Brits. He liked everything about the British. Like I said, I think he really hit it off with Donkin and Herbert Davy. And my dad had a great sense of humour, and it was, I would say, a British sense of humour. That was part of it. So he wanted to make my mum... I mean, I don't think he was really kicking and screaming being dragged to England. It was more that it wasn't something he had chosen. But, many ways they had a wonderful life there, and they met such wonderful people.
I just want to say that we have a lot of pictures of your uncle around our house.
I imagine, yeah.
We've been telling everyone that he's our uncle.
Good. Why not? Yeah. Oh.
I was just going to say that there's a lovely photo of Baba in Hollywood with one of the Hollywood stars, which was not Dietrich. But anyway, Adi is on the left of that.
Oh, really?
In that photo on the far left, Adi, your father, is Tulula Bank.
Yeah. Yeah, but Marlene Dietrich took a particular liking to my dad. She, yeah.
You mentioned that Baba had put his hand on your mother's head because your grandmother said she was getting too tall, and then she didn't grow anymore.
Yeah.
How tall did she stop?
She was actually, I think, 5'7", which is really tall. I'm generalizing terribly, but I think in those days for a woman to be that tall, and my maternal grandmother was also tall, yeah.
And you should mention about her youngest brother.
Yes, my uncle, my mother's youngest brother, was 6'7", and suffered a bit. I mean, physically that was really, really a tough thing. Yeah, so...
Okay, I'll make this the last question. You shared before with me a little bit about your father and his personality and a little bit about his love for Baba from what you got to observe growing up with them. I thought maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, my father was, like all the brothers, 100% devoted to Baba, loved Baba. He was, he was different. I mean, I got to know my uncles a little bit, Jal and Beram, and I really loved them. I didn't meet them that much, but I loved them so much. My dad was, as I've said, he was the youngest by quite a bit. Money came after him. He was the intellectual of the family. I think Baba used to tease him, a little bit. My dad was quite erudite. He read. He was very scholarly. I grew up. He knew Hafiz. I grew up with him reciting Hafiz. That was sort of our household experience. He didn't talk much about times with Baba. I grew up with a few Baba stories, more than a few, and they were wonderful. And I actually often would ask him to tell me more. And he was a little reluctant. And looking back, I wonder if it made him a little sad to remember Baba, because he missed him so much in that way. But jumping ahead, and I'll get to this on Sunday if people are interested, when we had the influx of American Baba lovers who came to our house after Baba dropped his body, my dad would tell them so many stories. So I would sit and listen to those stories. He, as I mentioned, all of those English Baba lovers, I'm sure you've heard of, like Will and Mary Beckett. I mean, they all really rallied around my parents when my parents moved there. So they used to have little meetings. My father wasn't one for meetings. I mean, he started a few and then they didn't continue. My dad was very funny, very witty, very charming. He was quite intrepid. Again, I think to come to a foreign country and not have, the background in a career specifically, to just jump into that. I think both my parents, were quite courageous. I mean, I think all immigrants are extraordinary. My parents were much luckier than most. He was very intuitive. So he didn't display that too often. He didn't constantly share that. And I think if he had, I wouldn't have paid any attention to anything I would have just switched off. But when he said something, and Jay has experienced this too, it was so rare and it was so succinct that, you listened, you paid attention, because it was done without much fanfare, but it was just something he'd say, something, and it's like, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to pay attention. And for those of you who met my Aunt Money, she was also extremely intuitive. So same thing. If she said something to us, yeah, we did it, So my dad was a little inscrutable in some ways. He was very humorous, and he had one of the best laughs I've ever come across. And probably some of you knew Erica and Adele, yeah. So he and Heather became very close family friends when this, I will say, influx of American Baba lovers began. Jay was one of the first. Erica and Heather stayed with us innumerable times en route to and from India. And my dad and Eric just really hit it off. So they would laugh and laugh and laugh. And I remember, sort of wishing I could be in that club. It was just so much fun to hear them. The other thing about my father, which surprised some people. So, back in 1969, 1970, excuse me, when the Americans started coming, we called it the American wave, because when my parents first moved to England, actually after Baba dropped his body, they started to hold monthly meetings. Baba dropped his body on a Friday, I think. Anyway, they would have monthly meetings on the last Friday of every month. And those meetings lasted for a year, and that was when the English wave, the newcomers to Baba, came. And I'll talk about this a bit more, but, Pete Townsend, and it was an incredible time. And especially for me, I mean, I was this sort of 11-year-old at that point, and to have all these people in the house, it was really great, But he was a very worldly man. And so when the Americans especially came, people, and I'm talking lots and lots and lots of Americans came through our house, stayed with us, Some we became best friends and husbands, and some we never heard from again, And my parents were extraordinarily generous. They were just incredible because they would feed everyone. I think they just felt they had to do this. Oh, and I should say, the reason all the Americans were coming was after Baba dropped his body. A couple of people came before Baba dropped his body. Rick Chapman might have been one. Anyway, after Baba dropped his body, American Baba lovers wanted to go to India. And in those days, it was cheaper to stop off in London. So, and everyone was a hippie. So they'd arrive in London, and no plans, no forewarning. They'd phone up my parents and say, we're here, we're Baba. And unbelievably, my parents would get in the car, my mother would, and this is the car that actually Baba provided for our family, and she'd go and pick up these strangers. And sometimes people did write, and we did have an introduction in that way. But we had all sorts of people staying at our house, all sorts. And a lot of people, rather understandably, we're meeting Baba's brother, and they thought he'd be very pious, that he might be wearing robes, white robes. It's like, they were really disabused of that. I mean, my dad was, as I say, very down to earth. And he really didn't enjoy sanctimony. So some people who came, he talked to them. And I used to call it the treatment. But he'd kind of, just say to them, look, come on, don't just be yourselves, be natural. I think it's honest to say that many people who came through our house and met my dad and my mum, she was more in the background, cooking, cauldrons of food for all these people who come. Many people were very affected by the time spent with my father. And many people spoke about how coming to Mehermanzil was sort of a stepping stone. Then they go to India. And they maybe had a slightly clearer idea of what they were doing. I can't really explain it very well, but it is true to say many people were very impacted by meeting my dad. Yeah. Jai Baba, thank you.